Ethel's joy, though, would last less than 2 months, when a succession of tragedies would strike the Skakel and Kennedy families, a sequence of deaths and injuries that would continue virtually unabated for a period of 20 months, culminating with fatal gunfire in Los Angeles. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Tia Denise, and we're going to keep going in the other Mrs. Kennedy today, but we're in a new part. Now we're talking about her as a senator's wife. So she's done being the attorney general's wife. He resigned from that job, and now he's on to bigger, better. This chapter is insane. This part is wild. And I wish that I had the time to read it to you from top to bottom. It's just one weird, tragic, unbelievable episode after another. And at the beginning of this part, Ethel has this premonition. I think she even has a dream that terrible things are coming. And when I read that, I was like, oh, she's got a premonition. And the bad thing that's going to happen is that, we know what happened to Bobby. And I thought, oh, it's so sad that she had that premonition. That was one of a series of unbelievably tragic things that are going to happen for the Skakel family and other family friends. The Kennedys have been having their tragedies, on and on and on. Miscarriages, baby deaths, plane crashes. But now, it is like a machine gun of tragedy has just fired on Ethel's life. And quite frankly, I don't even know how she was mentally coping by the time Bobby's assassinated, which of course doesn't happen in this part, but we know that's coming. But that's the culmination of this stretch of years that were just unbelievable in their tragedy and in the scope of the weirdness of the tragedies. So anyway, I can guarantee you that the 2 episodes that will be on this chapter will floor you. I was sitting there, as I've said many a time with this book, my mouth agape at what I was reading. I almost called up my sisters and was like, let me tell you about this, but I know they're listening and I know they're watching. I don't want to spoil it for them. But you guys, hang on. Because, some of these things are so, sad. I was like, why was Ethel not committed? I would have been committed. I would have been committed if this had happened to my people. And if this had happened to my family. If my brothers and sisters were dealing with this kind of thing. If my nieces and nephews were dealing with this kind of thing. I wouldn't be able to handle it. So, okay, I've gabbed and gabbed. Now you guys want to know. And I'm telling you, it doesn't disappoint with the crazy. Okay, so the first chapter is called Camelot versus the Great Society. Of course, Camelot being the Kennedys, the Great Society being Johnson. Only hours after Bobby was sworn in as the junior senator from New York, on the evening of January 4th, 1965, he and Ethel attended the Women's National Press Club's annual party for lawmakers of the 89th Congress. Bobby brought the house down when he spoke about his political future. I have absolutely no presidential ambitions, he declared, an impish smile spreading across his face. And neither does my wife, Ethel Bird. Wisecrack or not, Bobby's comment underscored 2 truths that Washington insiders had become well aware of over the past year. Ethel's undeniable popularity and power, and the rancor that existed between Bobby and Lyndon, and therefore between Ethel and Lady Bird. After Jack's death, the surface friendliness between the 2 women had all but vanished. Over the next few years of the Johnson administration, a catty rivalry would exist between the 2 camps, the one at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and the other at 1147 Chain Bridge Road in McLean. For her part, Lady Bird Johnson loved Texas and would have preferred going back to the Lone Star State. Ethel, on the other hand, savored Washington life and thrived on the power, the competitiveness, the intrigues. But each woman was fiercely loyal to her husband, and they became immersed in a game of one-upmanship, a low-key feud that provided fodder for Washington's gossip machine, though it never became public. It was war, the Great Society versus Camelot, an astute Washington observer declared later. As Barbara Hauer, the self-described arbiter of Texas and Washington taste, noted, loyalty to both the Johnsons and the Kennedys was impossible. To give Lyndon his due by day and mingle socially in the Kennedy world at night required Olympian stamina. Hauer was one of the few who was able to swing both ways without suffering too badly, at least for a time. As a popular party giver, she brought Johnson and Kennedy people together under the same roof. And she was the only LBJ insider to be invited to an anniversary party thrown for Bobby and Ethel by Ted and Joan. Once at a bash at the French embassy, Howard was on her hands and knees helping Linda Bird Johnson look for a lost contact lens when the president's daughter let the first family's true feelings be known. "Don't get your dress dirty," she said snidely. "Your Kennedy friends won't dance with you." Meanwhile, Ethel consistently invited the young, sexy, and energetic Howard to Hickory Hill parties, always making certain the papers played her up, which infuriated Lyndon. When Howard eventually ran afoul of the Johnsons, Ethel was ebullient. "She was even nicer to me after that," Howard said. The pettiness of both the Johnsons and the Kennedys was underscored by LaDonna Harris, who at the time was married to another freshman senator, Fred R. Harris of Oklahoma. When Bobby entered the Senate, LaDonna Harris became one of Ethel's new best friends. As a result, the Harrises were frequently invited to Hickory Hill and Hyannis, aggravating the president and his wife no end. Ethel was quite aware that the Harrises were close to the Johnsons and the Humphreys. Lyndon and Lady Bird didn't like our relationship with Ethel and Bobby, LaDonna noted years later. When we'd visit them at Hyannis, Lyndon would actually call us there, just to let us know that he knew we were with the Kennedys. Sometimes we felt as if we were in the middle of a snowball fight. Because of her intense competitiveness and feverish defensiveness, Ethel seemed always to be involved in one feud or another. As one member of her circle at the time said, underneath the cheerful exterior there was real anger. It was always there ready to surface like an armed submarine. One of her rows involved the Kennedys' old pal Red Fay, who had stepped down as Navy Undersecretary after Jack's death. In Ethel's view, Fay had violated two key commandments of being a member of the Kennedys' inner circle: discretion and secrecy. 3 years after the assassination, Harper and Row published The Pleasure of His Company, Fay's memoirs about his friendship with the Kennedys. In the preface, he described the book as the Journal of a Friendship, but Ethel saw it as a stab in the back because Fay had written about private conversations and embarrassing incidents. Ethel was particularly incensed by Fay's description of a Kennedy dinner, at which the patriarch criticized the young people for their extravagance. Bobby had gotten a look at the manuscript before publication, according to Arthur Schlesinger, and landed on Fay as if it were the only book through which posterity would ever know his brother. Bobby demanded that Fay cut nearly 40% of the book, which Fay refused to do, making just a few excisions. After the book was published, a friend of Ethel's revealed years later the Fays were off Ethel's list. When Bobby was assassinated in 1968, Fay came to the funeral, and eventually his friendship with Ethel resumed. But by that time, the Fays had returned to California, and they rarely had occasion to see Ethel. Paul Newman also became a target of Ethel's wrath. Several years back, he had incensed her by pulling out of the planned The Enemy Within film project. More recently, Newman had infuriated her once again by enthusiastically joining a group of intellectual and celebrity liberals, Gore Vidal, James Baldwin, Nat Hentoff, in a Democrats for Keating committee. Now, Ethel had it in for Newman. She released her dark rage one sunny afternoon under the guise of a friendly game of tennis. From the moment they got on the court, Ethel wouldn't let up on Paul, recalled LaDonna Harris, who witnessed the match. Ethel had an unhealthy kind of competitiveness, a masculine kind of meanness, real tough guy stuff. I was shocked at her treatment of Paul. She told him he was a lousy player. She teased him nonstop, hard teasing, real mean teasing, hard hitting. He just didn't know how to deal with it. He finally walked off the court. He had tears in his eyes. Another target was the gentlest and most fragile of the Kennedy women, Joan, Ethel's jilted and alcoholic sister-in-law. Joan was constantly comparing herself to the other Kennedy women and finding fault with herself. She viewed Rose as a saint, Jackie as a consummate sophisticate, and Ethel as the epitome of motherhood. I just couldn't keep up. The Kennedys were so good at everything, and I'm a flop, she once said. After she had 2 consecutive miscarriages, Joan told a friend, I always admired Ethel and I wanted to have as many children as she had. Joan had good reason to feel intimidated by Ethel, as evidenced by an incident at a dinner party at Joan and Ted's house. Besides Ethel and Bobby, the other guests included Senator Birch Bayh, Eunice and Sergeant Shriver, the Harrises, and a couple of Harvard psychiatrists who'd been invited by Eunice. Out of the blue, Ethel started criticizing Joan on the way that she'd set the table, the salt serving that she'd used, just about everything, recalled LaDonna Harris. It was totally uncalled for, totally unnecessary, and it made everyone feel self-conscious and uncomfortable. Joan tried to ignore it, but it made her feel terrible. She was near tears. I always felt sorry for Joan because Ethel was always too mean to her. On another occasion, Ethel attacked the way Joan had dressed for an afternoon of boating. Joan showed up wearing a beautiful leopard print bathing suit with a hat and a matching scarf, looking like she just stepped out of Vogue, said LaDonna Harris, who once again was present. And as soon as Ethel saw her, she went after her with a vengeance. "Why did you dress up? Did you think someone was going to be taking pictures? Maybe I should dress up like a model too." She was just so mean for no reason, taking those backhand slaps at Joan just because she looked so glamorous. And here we see, I think, one of Ethel's secret insecurities, in that Ethel wasn't glamorous. She was cute and perky, but I wouldn't say that she was like a knockout in any way. And a lot of people thought Joan was very beautiful. And not only was Joan beautiful, but they thought, Joan had a certain way of presenting herself. Some people thought it was tacky, but some people thought it was fabulous. And I think that because no one was ever going to talk about Ethel in those terms as fabulous, a knockout, Joan had been a former model. I think that she just was trying to cut Joan down. I mean, obviously, it's so sophomoric to go after what somebody's wearing and try to act like, there's something wrong with it when somebody looks nice, because all it does is show that you feel insecure about what you're wearing. I mean, it never works. Like, nobody buys into that kind of stuff. And most people who have matured whatsoever would leave that kind of trash talk back in middle school. Because by the time you're an adult, you realize that it all just comes bouncing back at you when you're catty and mean to people. Because all it really says is, I'm trying to act like this person's out to lunch, but my behavior is showing that, I've been raised in a barn. So at some point, some people are like, maybe I'll just shut up. Maybe I just keep it to myself that I feel insecure. Maybe she really did think Joan was overdressed, but who cares? Who cares? Is the sun going to fall out of the sky because Joan decided to wear a matching headband and bathing suit? Is the earth going to open up and hell itself vault forth because Joan's wearing a leopard print bathing suit and a matching hat? Friends believe that Ethel targeted Joan because she wasn't strong like the other Kennedy women. Ethel despised weakness of any kind, George Terrian observed. It was just so un-Kennedy in her mind, so she took it out on Joan whenever she could. And that was the same attitude she had with her own sister Georgianne, who was an even bigger boozer than Joan. Richard Burke, who served as a senatorial aide to Ted and had close ties to the family before he suffered a nervous breakdown, not surprisingly, remembered that Ethel, quote, had a very condescending attitude toward Joan, because Joan was really sick. Ethel didn't deal very well with anybody's illness. It was like Ethel had two personalities. She could show compassion and be very attentive to people who were ill. But if they were people who were close to her, or people she relied on, she took that as weakness and acted resentful toward them. And that's the way she treated Joan, in a condescending manner, like a little girl. Ethel's anger toward Joan also stemmed from jealousy. There was no question, said a member of Ethel's circle, that Ethel wasn't crazy about her friends becoming too friendly with Joan and her pals. At parties, Ethel always kept tabs on who was there for her and Bobby, and who was there for Joan and Ted. Whenever Rose Kennedy had a special guest at Hyannis, she'd usually invite Ethel and Joan. To Ethel's dismay, Rose was quite fond of Ted's wife. In Joan, Rose saw a dignity that she felt Ethel didn't possess. Rose once described Joan as strikingly beautiful, a woman who, quote, caused heads to turn wherever she went, a view she would never hold of Ethel. Well, because, you can't make a reality out of thin air. I think Ethel had a certain cuteness to her. There's a lot of pictures I see of Ethel where I'm like, oh, she's kind of cute, just kind of like perky, she's cute. But, probably nobody would describe her as beautiful. Although I'm sure there's pictures of her where somebody might describe her as beautiful. You just have to deal with the hand of cards you've been dealt. Ethel had a lot of other things going for her, or potentially had a lot of things going for her. There's no reason to get hung up on the fact that you're not beautiful. You've got so many other things to offer. Who cares if Joan gets a compliment? You're probably getting compliments from Rose that Joan could never get. Just take what you get and run with it. Don't sit around and be mean to Joan because, nobody ever called you beautiful. It's going to be okay. Probably nobody ever called Joan peppy. But anyway, because of how intimidated and nervous she felt in the presence of the Kennedy women, Joan, who was drinking heavily, usually begged off coming to events that Rose had invited her to. And Ethel was usually put in the position of having to cover for Joan, which she was loath to do because it involved lying to Rose, the woman she most admired and most feared. Ethel would come into my office and say, "Did you tell the guests that Joan isn't coming?" She'd put it off on me to make some excuse for her, recalled Barbara Gibson, one of Rose Kennedy's secretaries. Ethel treated Joan like a sick child. They all did. Ethel and the others tried to hide Joan's drinking problem from Rose as a means of protecting Rose, but not for Joan's sake. When Ted Kennedy considered making a run for presidency, members of the family met with doctors who were treating Joan for her alcoholism. The reason for the secret summit, held in a private suite near National Airport, was to determine whether Joan could hold up through the demands and rigors of a presidential campaign. Eunice immediately rallied to Joan's side. Jean, who had introduced Ted to Joan, said that she'd help Joan as much as she could. Ethel's feelings were clear, too. Well, she conceded to help. She had extremely negative views about alcoholism, having come from a family of heavy drinkers. She strongly believed that Joan's problem would be a major deficit for Ted, and she expressed her misgivings in front of Joan. "It would be dangerous," she said to those in attendance. To be a woman in the Kennedy family was a tough chore, noted Ethel and Bobby's pal Gerald Tremblay. Joan couldn't stand it. She couldn't weather the storm. Ethel, on the other hand, was a master at being a Kennedy. Both Jackie and Joan retreated, but Ethel didn't retreat. Here's the thing, though. Ethel might have been the only one telling the truth at that little shindig, where they try to decide, should Ted run for presidency? Look, Ted running for presidency has nothing to do with Joan as why that thing would fail. But if they were focusing on Joan for the moment, Ethel's right. It could be dangerous. Do we need to put somebody out in the open who's already showed cracks of strain because the Kennedy life is hard? Then we try to pile on a presidency in which she's supposed to prop up this nincompoop? Come on. And Ethel's like, I think it could be dangerous to put, somebody who is an alcoholic out front and center who's already struggling. I don't know how she said it. I'm sure she didn't say it very gracefully because she didn't like Joan. But, Eunice and Jean, that's very kind of them to be like, we'll help in any way we can. But no, the best way to help her is not to put her in a situation that's going to cause her to drink some more. Anyway, let's talk about the next chapter, because the next chapter is entitled A Premonition. And this is where Ethel realizes that something bad's going to happen, though she doesn't know what. And she could never, ever have conceived that what her life was going to look like for the next couple of years was going to be what this premonition was about. Okay, so the chapter says, for Ethel, the summer of 1965 began with a premonition. One night, when Bobby was away on senatorial business, she shot up from a deep sleep. She had dreamed, or thought she had, that something terrible was about to happen. She got out of bed, checked on the children, and returned to her room, but had difficulty getting back to sleep. The dream had left her with a sense of foreboding. Still thinking about it the next day, she telephoned her sister. I remember Georgie Ann telling me that Ethel was quite frightened, recalled George Terrian. She said the dream had involved injury or death of someone close to her. Georgie Ann had told her not to worry, that it probably had to do with all the stuff she was still feeling about Dallas and Ted's plane crash, but Ethel was unnerved, certain it was a premonition of some sort. At the end of June, Ethel and Bobby, 7 of their 9 children, and a few close friends, flew west for a week-long adventure that would include riding the rapids in Idaho's treacherous Salmon River, ominously known as the River of No Return. The trip, they'd made a similar one the year before, had all been Bobby's idea. Ethel had initially balked. Why did they have to go to some godforsaken place in the middle of nowhere? Even though she'd flown all over the world with Bobby, Ethel had an intense fear of flying that had started with the death of her parents a decade earlier. Now, in order to fly, she required a drink or two and sat clutching her rosary with white knuckles until the plane landed safely. After Ted's recent air tragedy, her dread had only worsened. Before leaving for Idaho, Ethel telephoned her sister again. I still can't shake that feeling, she said. I hope we make it, but if not, I'll see you in heaven. On July 1st, a dozen Kennedys and their friends, former astronaut John Glenn Jr., singer Andy Williams, mountain climber James Whitaker, and Lem Billings, were ferried safely from Sun Valley 80 miles northwest to a place called Jackass Flats. The flight had been a tricky one. The route called for the small planes to fly into a canyon, tilt 90 degrees for hairpin turns, and then come down over a rise before landing. Ethel, who wanted to get it over with, was the first one in, arriving ashen-faced. Bobby came in the second flight, grinning broadly, aware of her fear. He teased her. How's that? Ethel was still shaking. Never again, she shuddered. Never again. Despite her anxiety, the trip went off without a hitch. Over the next week, the Kennedys and their chums battled the rapids in inflatable yellow boats without incident. Afterward, the Kennedys left Idaho for Western Canada, where Ethel and Bobby received a tumultuous welcome from some 400,000 spectators on hand for the Calgary Stampede. By the time Ethel got home, her sense of foreboding had evaporated. That dream I told you about, she said to a friend, it's all forgotten. But a month later, when 3 of her children were injured within days of one another, Ethel's uneasiness returned. I knew there was something to it, she told Georgie Ann. That dream, it's with me all the time now. The first injury involved 11-year-old Bobby Jr., who required 100 stitches for severe leg lacerations and a severed tendon suffered when he crashed through a window after jumping off a garage roof on the Kennedy compound. The more serious injury, one reminiscent of Ethel's childhood, was suffered by 14-year-old Kathleen, who, like her mother, had become an accomplished equestrian. During the past summer, Kathleen had won 4 blue ribbons for excellence in horsemanship, but her riding days were almost ended on August 29th. And competing at West Flash Farms in West Barnstable, Kathleen's mount, Attorney General, failed to clear a hurdle, tripped over the barrier, and somersaulted over the girl, leaving her unconscious and bleeding internally. An ambulance rushed her to Cape Cod Hospital, which was 15 miles away. Meanwhile, authorities tried to find her parents. At that moment, the Kennedys and 6 of Kathleen's brothers and sisters were en route to Hyannisport from Sag Harbor in rough seas and strong winds, aboard the 70-foot yawl, the Nereus. An appeal went out to Coast Guard patrol vessels to try to intercept the Kennedys' boat and notify the family of the accident. After a 3-hour search, the boat was located near Buzzards Bay Light. A coxswain aboard a Coast Guard cutter yelled through a bullhorn that Kathleen had been hurt, the extent of her injuries not yet known. Bobby felt that he should be at her side, but the 8 to 15-foot waves and the 30-knot winds made it difficult for him to transfer safely from the schooner to the cutter. Rather than wait, he decided to swim to the boat. And in near panic over Kathleen's accident, Ethel tried to restrain him, demanding that he at least wear a life jacket. Bobby protested that it would interfere with his swimming, but relented when Ethel threatened to go with him. Placing a small orange floater around his neck, he dove into the rough waters. Waves washed him 50 yards through a boiling sea toward the cutter, and within minutes he was safely aboard. Shortly after the cutter left for Woods Hole, the winds picked up, and a gust sent a boom slamming painfully into 12-year-old Joe Kennedy's chest and knocking the boy flat on the deck. Ethel administered first aid, but luckily he was not seriously injured. "It was that dream," Ethel told her sister later. "I could feel it." The cutter carrying Bobby reached Woods Hole 4 hours after Kathleen's accident. State police rushed Bobby, still in sailing garb and bare feet, to the hospital, where Kathleen had now regained consciousness and was being treated for a mild concussion, a contusion of the bladder, and internal bleeding. In a nearby room, Bobby Jr. was still recuperating from his badly cut leg. Several hours later, the Nereus, under Coast Guard escort, limped into a protective cove near Woods Hole, her sails torn. Frantic with worry, Ethel was taken by police escort to the hospital. By the time she got there, Ted Kennedy had had 2 Boston doctors flown to Cape Cod to examine Kathleen. Surgery wasn't necessary, and Kathleen made a quick recovery. In Washington, President Johnson had heard about the Kennedy mishap, and despite the animosity that existed between the two sides, dashed off an encouraging note to Ethel and Bobby. "Take heart. Children do grow up despite rooftops, horses, and boats. My devotion to the children, and my sympathy to you both, since I know no remedy for the gray hair these incidents promote." To Kathleen, he sent a bowl of yellow Texas roses in the shape of a horse, along with some words of guidance. "It's no fun to part company with a horse, especially in midair, and I speak from experience. But the best thing to do is pick yourself up, brush yourself off, start all over again. And I know you're the girl with the spirit to do it." The president had also sent notes and flowers to Bobby Jr. and Joe, both of whom responded that they were making quick recoveries. When Kathleen was finally declared out of danger, Bobby went off to a clam bake for friends and former campaign supporters. Ethel relaxed by playing golf, but her dream of a few months back was uppermost in her mind. She was clearly worried. "I believe it was a warning," she told Georgianne. What next? Now, this next chapter is called Nacky Baby, and it's about Ethel and some of her peculiarities. The chapter goes on to say that Bobby's career as a U.S. Senator from New York had little, if any, impact on life at Hickory Hill. Though he and Ethel had bought a 5-room apartment in the fashionable United Nations Tower, they spent little time there. The apartment was far too small for the family, and was used strictly as a way to stave off critics who were keeping the carpetbagger issue alive. The Kennedys had shopped for quite a while before settling on the $68,000 co-op, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a combination bar and pantry, and a living room, 2 walls of which was a continuous stretch of floor-to-ceiling windows running almost 50 feet across. While Ethel stayed at Hickory Hill, Bobby usually commuted to New York several times a week to work out of the office on East 45th Street, using the apartment as a stayover. By spring 1967, Bobby had become the largest Senate employer. His staff now numbered 63 members, 15 more than New York's senior senator, Jacob Javits. In Washington, Ethel showed a distinct lack of interest in activities for Senate wives. She was usually missing from the weekly Red Cross meetings, where the wives wore seersucker dresses and made bandages. At Senate receptions, Ethel could never remember the names of the cabinet members' wives and was constantly giggling and asking LaDonna Harris for help. Meanwhile, Ethel continued to throw huge parties for friends and galas for charities at Hickory Hill. In the spring of 1966 alone, she had picnics and cookouts for hundreds of children, all the while trying to oversee her own uncontrollable brood. At one event, Ethel had to rush in the backyard when somebody told her that 10-year-old David was risking a broken neck by jumping higher and higher on a trampoline, while overhead a small car supported by ropes carried young guests back and forth across the lawn. She cheered benefits for the Stone Ridge School and rubbed some liberal guests the wrong way by having black maids with little doilies on their heads serving coffee in the dining room. Her big party of the year, a virtual reunion of the old JFK crowd, was the 75th birthday for Ambassador-at-Large Avril Harriman. Ethel's social life had become so full, and she was at the hairdresser so often, that she finally had Evelyn, co-owner of Christie's hairstylist in McLean, install a special telephone for her use only. Ethel had come to be known as a Nacky Baby, a description coined by members of the Washington Swinging 60s set. While Bobby was making headlines with his increasingly negative views about the Vietnam War, Ethel was making news of her own by occasionally wearing way-out skimpy dresses. She showed up at an elegant farewell dance for George Bundy with Bobby and a suitcase. While Bobby mingled with the guests, she ran upstairs and changed. When she came back down, she started a near fashion riot, shocking the more conservative women of LBJ's crowd, with a futuristic outfit that could only be described as Flash Gordon Flapper. While other women wore floor-length chiffons, Ethel had chosen boots and a straight shift of black and white blocks on vinyl with spaghetti-thin shoulder straps studded with rhinestones. "Is it linoleum?" one guest asked. Ethel told friends she'd bought the dress at a new hip store in New York called Paraphernalia, where everything is so way out, it's in. I decided to wear it because everybody was talking about Vietnam, and I thought we all needed a change of pace, so I put on my new dress. Okay. One congressman's wife, looking askance at Ethel, said, "If I wore those short skirts, my husband would lock me up." I don't know what that says about your husband, but also, how about we talk about our own personal dignity? Ethel. But you know why I feel like Ethel also did that? Because Joan was given to wearing short skirts and boots and clothes that were maybe more trendy than classic. And I feel like Ethel just wanted the same attention that Joan had gotten. I mean, did we not already cover the fact that she's jealous of Joan? And I feel like she just did that to be like Joan. While the press and outsiders only saw Ethel's wacky wild side, a few of her closest friends perceived something different. They had started to interpret her growing flamboyance as a shield for what they saw as insecurity and resentment. Insecurity about her abilities, resentment at the limitation of her role as the Kennedy wife. As a woman of the Klan, she was restricted from having a career of her own, or from even expressing herself in ways more serious than party-giving and outrageous dressing. Poor Ethel had to wear vinyl dresses and toss people into swimming pools to call attention to herself. All the Kennedy wives were squelched, said a member of Ethel's inner circle. LaDonna Harris had a similar view. Women's lib was making itself known, and all of us were beginning to blossom out, to become full participants in what was happening, to grow. But Ethel seemed to be afraid. Her life revolved around being very supportive of Bobby, a role she was very schooled in. Only on rare occasions did Ethel make her feelings known on political or social issues. After having read a New York Times story about a family planning program run by the Peace Corps in Bombay, Ethel hit the ceiling. Vehemently opposed as a Catholic to any form of birth control, she wrote an irate letter to Peace Corps director Jack Vaughn complaining about 52 U.S. volunteers assisting in vasectomy operations. But Ethel never made Bobby aware of her correspondence with Vaughn, which would have been viewed harshly by him as a violation of the code of silence imposed on Kennedy wives. For the most part, though, Ethel obeyed the unwritten family rules. LaDonna Harris recalled an incident that she felt underscored the restrictions imposed upon Ethel. At a small dinner party at Rose's house, the conversation turned to Bud Wilkinson, the University of Oklahoma's star head football coach, who had been a consultant to President Kennedy's physical fitness program. All the women agreed that, while Wilkinson was a superb athlete and leader, he was too much of a conservative, too right-wing in his views. Jackie then admitted that she and Ethel had expressed their feelings about Wilkinson's politics in the form of, quote, unsigned poison pen letters to the president. Harris said she was dumbfounded when she heard the story. I felt it was really sad that Ethel had to put her thoughts in writing in little secret notes, that she felt she didn't have the right to be openly critical and express her views. It was kind of pathetic. Okay, now let's get on to this chapter called The Death Wish, and this is really when things start going to hell in a handbasket, to put it mildly. This chapter is about the death of her brother George, who, not surprisingly, is going to meet his end because of his grand folly. And I'm not being flippant about it, I'm just saying so many of these deaths are tragic. The death of a human is always a tragic event, but so many of them are foreseeable because George lived a really wild life. And even at this point, when he died, there was a lot of people who were sort of parting ways with him because it just seemed like he was too dangerous. This chapter says that in July 1966, Ethel received good news from her doctor. She was pregnant with number 10. If all went well, she finally surpassed Rose's record by 1 sometime the following spring. Ethel's joy, though, would last less than 2 months, when a succession of tragedies would strike the Skakel and Kennedy families, a sequence of deaths and injuries that would continue virtually unabated for a period of 20 months, culminating with fatal gunfire in Los Angeles. Ethel's dream, she later would tell confidants, had turned into a living nightmare. Ethel's brother George, now 44, had been the president of Great Lakes Carbon for more than a decade, and despite his imprudence and indiscretions, the company had fared well. Recently, George had authorized a $20 million purchase of a 4,600-acre Camelot ranch about 30 miles from Los Angeles for the development of expensive tract homes. But playing hard was still his first priority. The latest adventure on his itinerary, scheduled for September 1966, was a 10-day elk trip on the ranch that he was thinking of buying in Idaho, not far from where Ethel and Bobby had run the Salmon River Rapids a year earlier. But George was having trouble rounding up his usual gang of merrymakers. More and more of his friends had come to realize that being in George Skakel Jr.'s company could be a life-and-death proposition. In June 1966, his pal Bill Whiteford had married Betton Alloways, George's former girlfriend, and they were now living in Colorado. George called and asked them to come to Idaho with him. The old gang, including some of the other Swedish girls, would be there. He promised lots of fun and games. "My dad, who found George despicable," said Whiteford, "called me up and said, 'If you go on that trip, you're a lot dumber than I ever dreamed you were, because that son of a bitch is up to no good. Don't go. If you do, you deserve what you get, and that's going to be a set of horns.'" As a result of Bill's conversation with his father, chairman of Gulf Oil, Bill and Betton gave George their apologies. While the Whitefords and even Jim Skakel had bowed out, George was able to pull together a gregarious crew of about 20 friends. Most of them had flown out of Westchester Airport with Skakel aboard one of the Great Lakes Carbon planes, a Convair 300. The plane took them first to St. Louis to pick up some more pals, and then flew into Boise, where the crowd boarded 3 small planes chartered from the Johnson Flying Service, and one owned by Skakel. By the time they got to Tiny McCall, Idaho, in the late afternoon, George was suffering from a terrible toothache, which he had treated by a local dentist. He instructed all the others, except for 3, to complete the final leg of the trip, a 30-minute flight from McCall to the Shep Ranch, a primitive area of about 30 miles east of the town of Riggins. They left around 6 p.m. Less than an hour later, a single-engine Cessna 185 took off carrying George, his tooth fixed, and 3 companions. Dean Markham, 42, a father of 5, who now ran Great Lakes Carbon Washington, D.C. lobbying office, Lou Werner, also 42, George's CIA pal from St. Louis, and Earl Rampt, at 64 the oldest of the group, a veteran sportsman who'd been a close friend of George Skakel Sr. It was going on 8 when off-duty Air Force Master Sergeant Donald Adams attempted to land the plane in a tight canyon. On the ground, a crowd that included George's 13-year-old son, Mark, Lou Werner's wife, and several of George's Swedish ex-girlfriends watched in horror as the plane, loaded with guns and liquor, came in too high and overshot the short runway. Attempting to abort the landing, the pilot tried to pull up and make a last-minute turn, but the small craft was trapped by the nearly vertical walls of Crooked Creek Canyon. As the plane made its final pass before crashing, those on the ground could see George Skakel Jr. looking out the window, wearing that terrible grin he'd get on his face when he was looking down the muzzle of a police revolver, one of them recalled. That night, a search party of George's pals went into the canyon and found the bodies, and what was left of the plane, which had hit trees and slammed into the bank of Crooked Creek. "It did more than telescope," said a member of the party, New York businessman Tom Wyman, who was a State Department official during Jack Kennedy's administration. The plane disintegrated. The next day, a helicopter was sent into the desolate area to pick up the bodies. Ethel was at Hickory Hill when the call came, informing her of the crash. She was devastated. While she knew what a liability George could be to the Kennedys, she loved her brother intensely. After pulling herself together, she made 2 calls. One to try to reach Bobby, who was en route to Manchester, New Hampshire, to deliver the keynote address at the New Hampshire State Democratic Convention. The other to her sister Georgianne. After talking to Ethel, Bobby canceled his speech and flew to Massachusetts to pick up 2 of the Markham children and bring them back to Washington. His deep sorrow, he later told friends, was for Dean and his family, not for his brother-in-law. "That lunatic always had a death wish," Bobby told a colleague later, unforgivingly. He took my best friend with him. At Hickory Hill, a note arrived from the White House. Lady Bird and I just heard the news of the loss of your brother. Our hearts are with you, and we pray to God to ask him to sustain your faith and your courage at this lonely time, the president wrote. In Colorado, Ted Kennedy was on a 4-day Western campaign trip when his office reached him, and he grabbed the first commercial flight back to the Capitol. He was still suffering pain from the broken back he'd suffered in the plane crash less than 2 years earlier. Air crashes had now claimed the lives of 3 Skakels and 2 Kennedys, beginning with Joe Kennedy Jr. in 1944. Ethel, Bobby, and dozens of family friends attended the services for Dean Markham and McLean. The mourners then boarded a Great Lakes Carbon plane that took them to Watch Hill, Rhode Island, where Markham was buried. Then the mourners flew on to Greenwich, where, on September 28, 1966, more than 200 gathered at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greenwich to say a final goodbye to George Skakel. It was, said a Skakel family friend, quite a bizarre affair. Father Bill, Billy McCormick, who used to hang out with the Skakel boys in the old days, led the Requiem Mass. But there in the church, the only thing that was on everybody's mind was that George Skakel was the world's biggest sinner, and was probably burning in hell that very moment. The service was made even more strange by the bevy of George's blonde, blue-eyed babes sitting in the pews crying their eyes out. The Swedish mafia, as we called them. After the service, I was standing with Ethel, and even she was amused by the fact that there was this clutch of beautiful blondes who'd been her brother's girlfriends. Despite what Bobby felt about George, Ethel adored her brother, and deep down she thought he could do no wrong. The sad part was that George took good friends like Dean Markham with him when he went. Sarah Davis, who also attended the funeral, said that Ethel handled her brother's death as she had her parents, with incredible grace and incredible bravery. She never got maudlin or dramatic. She never shed tears that anybody saw. She dealt with it by ignoring it. She tried to find something else that was fun to talk about or do. That's the way she was about death. I envied her strong religious beliefs because I thought it's what got her through all the bad things in her life. But I just don't know if it was religion that got her through the bad things. I mean, I don't know if we can say that ignoring reality is religion. I think Philly D, I'll think about that tomorrow, could be a form of faith of, well, it's just, I can't do anything about it, so I'm not going to choose to dwell on something I can't change. So there is some truth to that. But I also think that sometimes what Ethel did wasn't rely on God, but I think she relied on distraction or just shallow thinking. And I just wouldn't call that religion, because religion is not shallow. It isn't, and people who say that it is are people who haven't experienced what faith is. It isn't the ignoring of the hard questions. It's the questioning the hard questions and getting answers. And I think that Ethel just sort of bandaged over reality and pigeonholed all sorts of little things in her mind and thought, I'll close that up in a box and I'll just leave it. And I won't open it again. And it's just, if I don't, then it didn't really happen, or I don't have to feel it. But I think that current of anger that they talked about earlier in the book, where Ethel could really go after people and could be quite mean sometimes, I think that stemmed from the fact that she had so many unresolved emotions that she just never dealt with. And this papier-mâché personality of just covering over all the hard things, I mean, eventually something's going to come that breaks it. I know Sarah Davis called it religion, but I don't know that I would. I don't know. Of course, we'll never know what was really going on in Ethel's mind. And I don't want to undermine her faith, because I do think her faith got her through things. I think if you believe that your loved ones are in heaven, you do grieve less, knowing that you'll see them again. And so I'm sure that she maybe what appeared to other people as her just sort of, bouncing through life and nothing really touching her and her being shallow. Maybe there was a depth to her that I'm not giving her credit for. I don't know. We'll never know. At Rushton Skakel's house in Greenwich, the future of Great Lakes Carbon was being hammered out. Well, my brother George's body was still warm, said Jim Skakel, still angry years later. Now, with George dead, another faction of the family, the Solaris, which Big Ann's sister Ethel had married into, was making a move to take over after years of feuding with some of the Skakels. But not Rushton Skakel. Now, in a controlling position, he appointed his cousin Joe Solari Jr., whom he affectionately referred to as, quote, a skinny guinea flopwop, to be the new president of Great Lakes Carbon. Ethel and the others were furious. Several months after George's funeral, his wife Pat, who had 18 volatile and rocky years of marriage, made a surprise appearance at the restaurant casino that Bill and Baton Alois Whitford owned in Vale. I was apprehensive when I saw her come in, Benton said later. But we sat at the bar and talked for a long time, and she admitted that she knew George had loved me. We talked about her kids and what had happened. It was all very civilized. I think she was trying to resolve in her own mind the kind of life George had had. 18 months after the crash, Lou Warner's wife filed a $1,375,000 negligence suit in U.S. District Court in Boise, Idaho, against Great Lakes Carbon and two subsidiaries, Rancho Palos Verdes Corporation, which owned the plane, and Rancho Idaho Incorporated, which leased it on the day of the crash. In December 1970, after a costly and nasty legal battle between old friends, Great Lakes Carbon finally agreed to pay Ann Warner and her children the sum of $90,000. Others, like Susie Markham, remained quiet and embittered. Down to the depths of her heart, she was very, very upset that George had taken Dean with him, said a friend of the Markhams. George was a wild man. Despite his craziness, George Skakel Jr. was remembered fondly, not so much by his widow or friends, or for that matter, even some family members, but by some of the biggest names in journalism who had palled around with him from time to time. Sports writer Red Smith wrote, "Big George was all man, all sportsman, all battle, and we could not afford to lose him." William Buckley, interestingly, wrote in his nationally syndicated newspaper column that had George not been related to Ethel and Bobby, his death would not have been noted on page 1 of the nation's newspapers. But on his own, Buckley wrote, George Skakel had a, quote, energy of his life which, in this jaded age of general fatigue, of philosophical Welch schmears, and 40-hour weeks, and unconditional surrender to television sets in the passive life, made him seem almost the eccentric, out of harmony with the rhythm of a sentient world, made him, too, impulsive, in mischievous and irresistible ways. How interesting that William Buckley, one of the founders of the modern conservative movement, should have framed the death of George Skakel as the death of somebody who was taking a stand against the laziness of too much television watching, and that his wild man ways and womanizing were just a way of him being eccentric. That's what you want to call it. That's where we end for right now, but that is just the beginning of the wild, wild tragedies that are going to happen and unfold in this chapter. And you won't believe what's coming in the next chapter, including negligent homicide. So don't miss the next episode. This episode was really all the setup for the way the rest of the chapter is going to go. And it's going to go just like this last bit did, about George dying in front of his son in a horrible, horrible plane crash. And that is a visual for the way the rest of the chapter is. Everybody just standing wide-eyed, unable to stop the moving train that is about to smash into the Skakel family. Could any family... People talk about the Kennedy curse. What about the Skakel curse? I mean, of course, it's not a curse. When you live wild, wild things happen. What is insane to me is that all of us are like well-versed in the Kennedys. Most people who are tuning into this channel because they enjoy stuff about the Kennedys probably know all the things that ever happened to the Kennedys. It's the Skakel part that is so shocking to me. And what I can't figure out is why, like, HBO or even Netflix hasn't decided to do a multi-part, like, biopic documentary sort of something. Like, this family would make the most epic series of all time. And I'm trying to figure out why no one's bothered. I mean, this would be like must-watch TV. If you thought this episode was eye-opening, just wait till the next episode, because that's really where this thing just explodes. Thank you guys so much for watching with me, and I will talk to you guys later. Oh, I keep forgetting to tell you. Okay, so I posted on the community tab yesterday that I am on X. I got on X because I was like, it'll be, sometimes I do these sort of like pop culture videos, and it's just easier to find out quickly what's going on X. But let me just tell you, I hate it with every fiber of my being. And do you know why? Because people are mean. Like, mean for like no reason. I posted a video the other day. It was like a short from YouTube I just posted on, and like within minutes I had people just eviscerating me. I mean, people calling me a bitch, a whore, to shut up, skank face. Like, what is this place that so many people like to hang out on? So I can't promise that I'll be on there a lot because I don't like it. If you really want to like criticize me, then criticize me. I can take it. But to just be called like a skank face, a bitch, a whore, shut up, like, I don't need the aggravation. So I can't tell you that I'll be on there all the time, but I'll be on there sometimes. So if you want to follow me, I'm on there. Here's my handle @RealCheerD. So you can find me there. And if you're on X, Follow me if you want to. I'm not highly committed to that platform, let me just say. Really, I just don't have time for social media at all. Like, those of you who follow me on Instagram know, like, I rarely post anything. But if you follow me, thanks so much. If not, whatever. I completely understand. You guys have lives. But I thought I should say. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want to. Whatever. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks again. Bye.